Okay, hi. My name's Tracy Whiter, bit of a hard act to follow, an Olympic rider. I hop on my horse and look like a sack of potatoes, but I'm still a crazy horse chick. So I'm exactly the same mentality when it comes to owning and looking after my horses. I just don't ride that well. I run a business called Cazedarnes Equestrian. I have a passion for horses, as probably a lot of us here do, and horse health and educating owners on how to keep their horses healthy. I'm hoping today that we get to discuss some ideas with you about managing our horses better, which most of us horse owners are striving to do. We're always striving to manage our horses better. I know personally at my place, I'm forever struggling with the balance between allowing that natural behaviour of locomotion, the social behaviour, the constant grazing that they need, and trying to match that with the diet and nutrition that they need. So when I started in the horse world, the land that my horses lived on were definitely secondary to the horses. I moved up like a lot of people do, and I can have horses, yay, look at all that land, how many horses can I fit in there? I've now come full circle, and I imagine that a lot of you guys here have as well, due to the fact that we're all sitting in this room saying, how on earth can we manage this a little bit better? I've come to the realisation that the land and the grass are the things that give us the key to opening up the euphoria, I guess, of matching horses' social and emotional needs and its nutritional needs, given that we're trying to do this on a very compressed scale from what they have evolved to do and how they work. So I'm hoping to provide you with a better picture as to why, in a nutritional sense, that these issues are ones that we must address for our horses. So I guess, where did it all begin? This is just a quick, interesting slide on how the horse evolved. We normally look at this as just a simple one-way trend towards a small, tiny horse with this round, horrid back and teeth back further in its skull, a lot shorter. But the reality is a lot more complex, and there was a lot of branches to lead us to the modern equus that we have today. We started, of course, with the dawn horse, or the Cazedarnes, about 55 million years ago. So that's a long time for us to develop this very, very specific animal we're faced with today. His diet consisted largely of foliage, fruit, herbs and berries. He's a browser, okay? So the history is browsing from the bottom, and this is what I want to highlight today. Then we can go up to somewhere in the middle here, where we have what we call the small horse, or the Myohippus. That's about 35 million years ago. This horse was about 7.2 hands high. Our early horse was about 3.2 hands high, so that's pretty weeny, more like a dog. By the time we got to the small horse, we've developed more molars, and this is what was significant in the development of the horse with regard to pastures and what we're talking about today. We're getting to the Pliohippus further up here on the scale that's called more horse, is what that word means. That was about 5 and 11 million years ago. 12.3 hands high, and we now have 3 incisors and 6 molars on each side of the jaw, which is a bit like the dentition that we have with our horses today. Our modern horse, the equus, has hypsodont teeth. So this is developed from the browsers that we started up into these extremely efficient grazers that we have today. The small incisors at the front are so efficient, they're like little scissors. And we have teeth that are continually erupting, much unlike ours. They're continually growing, erupting and wearing, so they are designed to do nothing but munch constantly and grind away. So today, we have modern equus, or our horses. We're presented with a highly evolved animal. It's an incredible athlete, and I think that's what makes, to explain to our grass people why we're so attracted to this animal. Is an extreme athlete, highly specific, and very well evolved with some very specific physiology. One of the things it allows it to do is to graze very efficiently. 70% of their time spent foraging and grazing, they're very suited to grazing short succulent pasture. That's really important. So they're quite happy to get really low and close to the dirt and cut that up. And that will become more significant as we move on and talk about what the nutrition is like in those grasses. And the hoof mechanism, I saw Pauline sneak in later on, so I'm sure she's happy to discuss the hoof mechanism with you, but it's designed to move. Okay, the entire horse is designed to move, not stand still. And this is the battle that we constantly have. In fact, the movement is the way that the horse actually gets circulation down to the bottom of its legs. So when we look at this natural locomotory behaviour, so horses have been shown to travel on open ranges to their water holes up to 65 to 80 kilometres in a day. When they're managed at pasture, the main initiator of the moving is their grazing. So if they don't have something to graze to, and we've all experienced the horses that stand at the gate waiting for the feed, even if they've got a paddock full of pasture in. So the grazing is their main initiator of locomotion. And the distance they cover in a decent-sized paddock is about 20 kilometres a day, just in a paddock to graze on their own feed, unless we start hand-feeding them and they stand at the gate. So the distance the grazing horse travels depends on the locomotion, it depends on where your water is, the availability of your food, and the time they spend grazing. So when we look at this behaviour and locking them in stables and yards, like we're talking about, it seems quite ludicrous. I'm scared of locking my horses in a stable and yard because I'm scared of how much and how fast they want to move those 20 or 65 kilometres when I sit on its back. If they're not receiving this amount of movement, so we just leave them grazing all day, right? That seems like the answer. And then we have the pastures. So our modern pastures are great for cattle and sheep. So left to their own devices, grazing in a pasture that's not overgrazed, now we're getting the problem of overnutrition. And here's the balance that we're having the struggle with, and probably something that you recognise yourselves and why we're here today. So they're confined to pastures of cultivated grasses and legumes and often provided with energy take much in excess of their needs. Not just energy, but some of the specific nutrients that a horse requires is provided much in excess of what we need. And funnily enough, our response to that is, what do I add? That's what we do. We say, what do I add to the diet? Because now I've got behaviour issues. So what do I add to combat that behaviour issue? What do I add to do this? But the problem is more likely that we're adding too much of a lot of things. So horses, as I mentioned earlier, are able to graze plants really close to the surface. So there's a few issues with that. But we know the stressed grasses contain the high NSC. By NSC, for those who aren't aware, non-structural carbohydrates. So we're talking about the carbohydrates that don't form a structure, are not fibrous, that they're the sucrose, fructan, which is really our big baddie. And those stressed grasses just accumulate the sugars in a much greater amount, but horses are still really efficient at getting them. Not only do they take that, they also are going to take the dirt. And we know what happens with that too. And when pastures are sparse, they will continue to graze and eat only palatable grasses or feed. The notion that they will feed and graze themselves and find what they need in their body, that they might be lacking some copper or lacking some minerals, so they find the appropriate plant, isn't true. They're going to eat what they like the most. And they'll continue to do that. Even we supplement them with feeds and we supplement them with hay, they'll walk around a paddock and leave some up high and graze some down low. It's the nature of the beast. So our problem, a horse will eat, I found this really interesting and I almost didn't want to see it. Eat, trample or damage 3% of its body weight per day. So if you're looking at a 500 kilogram horse, they're going to damage or eat approximately 15 kilograms per day. And I've worked that out based on a sort of 16-hour grazing. You know, I've gone to the less. Okay? Or 1 to 1.5 kilograms per hour. So when you look at the paddock, you know, when I went to my place, I'm like, look at that beautiful paddock. I could probably have 10 in there. I'll probably have 1 for about 3 months before the feed's gone or damaged. So can our paddocks handle the load? And I think a lot of us are noticing now that no, they can't really. And then can their digestive systems even handle the pasture that we've got? So I'm going to go briefly over their digestive system, and apologies to those of you who have been through this, some of you even with me, but it's really important that we're all starting on the same page when we start to learn about why we need to change some of the grasses that we're feeding. So the lips, tongue and teeth, right? Very, very suited for ingestion, finding their feed. And the interesting thing is a horse needs to chew more than cattle or sheep. So they more intensively masticate their food than cattle or sheep. Their upper lip's very strong and sensitive, and they can be very particular with what they do with their upper lip. The upper lip they also use, of course, as a funnel for water. So the ingestion rate of hay per kilogram of body weight is 3 to 4 times faster in cattle and sheep than ponies as well. So although the number of chews is similar, they ingest faster. The dry matter intake of body weight per chew is about 2.5 milligrams in horses and 5.6 to about 6.9 in sheep. And the important thing about that is that horses require longer grazing to be able to get the same nutrients in as our cattle and sheep. Sound teeth, this was really interesting, sound teeth. So if your teeth are all working really well and grinding perfectly, they reduce the hay and grass to less than 1.6 millimetres in length. That's tiny. And they make between 800 and 1,200 chews per kilogram of concentrate, but they make about 3,000 to 3,500 chews per kilogram of hay. So why is this important? Sort of seems irrelevant. But this is the beginning of the issues that we're having with this pasture. Saliva. Saliva is really important to the horse. It's only the physical presence of food in the mouth and the chewing action that stimulates the secretion of saliva. So you can't hover the pellets under its nose and it starts salivating like I do with lasagna and my daughter. Oh, I forgot we're recording. So there's no sight. They have to be chewing and they have to be ingesting food for this saliva to be produced. There's no digestive enzyme activity, but it does act as a lubricant and it prevents choke. And that's fairly important, but one of the most important things is it acts as a buffer for acidity in the digestive tract. It's really, really important. About 10 to 12 litres can be secreted daily of saliva in a horse fed normally, because of the amounts of chews they need to get through the hay. And they need that saliva. The bicarbonate content in the saliva is what provides the buffering capacity. So a buffer keeps the pH normal, or where it needs to be. Once it gets too acidic or too alkaline, that's what the buffer's job is to do. Its continuous secretion during eating buffers the digester in the stomach. So the digester is the stuff that it's chomped up, it's travelled through, sitting in the stomach, and it helps to buffer that and allows the microbes in there to do their job. Okay, there's a lot of microbes in the stomach, the hindgut of a horse, and it's really important that they can do their job. To do that job, it needs to have the correct pH. Okay, so this is just quick. When I refer to the foregut, or I'll refer to the small intestine and stomach, and the hindgut is basically the large intestine and the colon. This is a bit of a complex diagram, but one of the things that is really interesting to look at, I wonder if my pointer works. is the size of the stomach. That's tiny. It's tiny. 7.5 to 15 litres the stomach holds. Now, when you're looking at a 500 kilogram animal, that's tiny. And that's really significant. It's only about 1/4 of a metre in length. Horses are monogastric, so they only have one stomach. So huge difference between the cattle that a lot of the pastures have been designed for. It only holds food in the stomach for a short time. And when the horse stops eating, the stomach actually stops emptying. And this is kind of important too. Some of that food remains in the stomach for 2 to 6 hours, but that's all. So bear in mind, anybody who is, obviously not here, the people who are stabling and yarding, or if you're locking your horse up for a period of time, 2 to 6 hours after they have stopped chewing, there's no food left in the stomach, okay, and there's no saliva going in because they're not chewing. And this, I'll show you why this is important as we go on. While in the stomach, the food's mixed and soaked, we start with digestion and all the digestive juices, including hydrochloric acid. Half of the surface of the stomach is lined with cells that secrete the digestive juices, and the other half is not. So, and they secrete up to 10 to 30 litres of gastric juices daily. So those cells that don't secrete the gastric juices aren't very well protected from the action of the hydrochloric acid. So, empty stomach and hydrochloric acid. The important bit about that is that those gastric juices continue to be secreted regardless of whether the horse is eating or not. So now we're back to grazing them all day again, right? The hydrochloric secretion declines slowly when it's nearly empty, but at that time, the pH of the stomach is really acidic. The act of eating then stimulates the flow of saliva, and we buffer the rate at which the pH of the stomach content decreases. So this is a really finely tuned design system. Tiny stomach, continual flow, nice level acidic environment. Of course, as a sideline, this is where a lot of ulcers come from. Okay, so you can imagine fasting your horse and it being empty, the hydrochloric acid still being secreted, part of the stomach that isn't protected from those digestive juices, bang, we have ulcers. For today, the small intestine is all important, okay, because the small intestine is where we're going to digest simple sugars, polysaccharides, starches, and a little bits and pieces of other things, but significantly, the simple sugars. They have, so remembering we did about 1/4 of a metre of a stomach, a 450 kilo horse has about 21 to 25 metres of small intestine. Transit time is quite rapid, so it does move quite quickly, with some feed appearing in the cecum, which is at the end of the digestive tract, about 45 minutes after a meal. That's not a long transit time. So again, we're reinforcing we need this constant flow through this highly evolved digestive system. What leaves the small intestine? Lots of stuff. The really important thing, undigested feed carbohydrates. So any of the carbohydrates have not been digested, leave the small intestine and head down to the large intestine. Of course, that's not what the large intestine was designed for. So here's our problem. The hindgut, 64% of volume, but only 30% in total length. It's a fermentation tank, so it does do some fermentation, very similar to the rumen of ruminants, but clearly that's not what the horse was evolved to do. It has a fantastic microbial population. They're terrific at, breaking down the proteins, and in fact the microbes in the gut will produce a lot of the vitamins and some of the minerals, the vitamins that we need, particularly B1s. And it's a finely attuned system. And we need it to do the fermentation because we need energy. Or, obviously, too much of a good thing is not good either. So efficient hindgut fermentation is necessary. We break down the structural carbohydrates now. Cellulose and other structural, and also we're going to be digesting the leftover simple carbohydrates. And we're breaking down to volatile fatty acids. They're a major energy source and the horse needs them. But too much of a good thing is always bad, and I so hope that photo's photoshopped. So overloading the hindgut has a detrimental effect to the digestive process, and it does disturb the finely tuned balance of the horse's gut and its microflora. So this really is the crux of our problem. Overloading with starch and sugars into the hindgut. That's the issue. How does this happen? Lush pasture, which is an interesting word in itself, but pasture with high sugars, high non-structural carbohydrates, high grain will do the same sort of thing. We're going to increase the fermentation rate and elevate the productions of these volatile fatty acids. It increases the acid levels in the stomach and reduces the pH of the hindgut. We've got hindgut acidosis. Accumulation of this lactic acid overwhelms the normal buffering capacity of the saliva. And of course, the more concentrated the feed is and the more nutrient rich, the less they're chewing, the less saliva, the less buffering action that we've got, and the higher the acid in the stomach. But of course, if we just add a supplement, that'll all be okay. Bacterial balance is disrupted as the numbers of bacteria that can't survive in that acidic environment reduce, and we increase the amount of bacteria that can survive. And we produce lovely bacterial endotoxins, which lead to some laminitis and colic. So our problem, so all of a sudden we've gone again, now we've got to lock them up again, okay, because we can't have them on this pasture, but we've got to let them out because they have to graze. Here's our issue. Current pasture species are selected with sheep and cattle in mind. And forage scientists have in fact implemented programs to increase the concentration of carbohydrates. In some conditions, grass hay may have up to 35% of sugar, starch and fructans. It was really interesting earlier that Megan mentioned that the grass hay and the meadow hay was putting weight on her horses better than oaten hay, where a lot of people with laminitic horses or horses with metabolic issues tend toward buying meadow and grass hay. It's not necessarily lower in sugar, okay? So it was really interesting. Grass breeders actually select for nutrient density. So again, the non-structural carbohydrates are one of the baddies, I guess, of horse nutrition. Not in small amounts, but in amounts that cause an overload situation. So the fructan is the one that has been pointed to quite a lot in some of the research regarding our horse physiological issues. So knowing how the horse digests and is evolved to graze assists in understanding how these improved pastures are leading to a myriad of our horse health issues. You may be facing some of these yourself, and I know I am. The balance between letting them graze and locking them up and still meeting the nutrient requirements. So hopefully today we're going to start looking at some possible alternatives for this. So what are the health issues? Laminitis, one big one. A leading cause of death in horses, second only to colic. It's so painful. And it's a horrific thing to watch a horse go through, and once they have it, or if they're prone, it's a cycle. Insulin can induce laminitis. So this implicates the dietary carbohydrates as they have insulin-producing metabolic effect. Same as us. You throw in some sugar, the body produces some insulin to combat that sugar and break it down. So the excess fermentation of the fructan favours the rapid proliferation of bacteria that produces the lactic acid, like I said earlier, and a range of toxins. So this activates enzymes in the hoof wall that break down the cellular bond that anchors the hoof wall to the pedal bone. Again, all pointing to these pastures Colic, the leading cause of horse death. One of the causes of colic, and I say one because there are many, is excess digestible carbohydrates. Again, either grain or pasture. Rapid fermentation of the carbohydrate actually draws water from the bloodstream into the large intestine, and you actually can cause a mild state of dehydration temporarily. So this is not going to help a colic case. And you'll see that the rapid fermentation produces the acids, as we've discussed earlier, and the acids can alter the bowel mobility and the altered microbial population, and we've also got gas producing. So a lot of this these high sugars and this, I guess, malfunctioning of the gut and moving away from how it was designed to work is causing some of these issues. And insulin resistance, or metabolic syndrome, or type 2 diabetes, we call it in people, or McDonald's disease. We're seeing this in horses now. One of the big things that's really interesting is that horses don't develop pancreatic exhaustion. So in people, when we create a lot of insulin and we're going up and down and our insulin's spiking and dropping, our pancreas goes, forget it. I'm just not listening to the signals anymore. Horses don't do that. So they can produce vast quantities of insulin. And here we go again, back to our laminitis issue. So equine metabolic syndrome refers to horses with a history of laminitis, and even though the insulin concentrations are elevated, the glucose and free fatty acid concentrations of them are often normal. So anything that is elevating that insulin and elevating that level of carbohydrates and overloading the system is definitely the biggest part of our problem. And we're going to break for morning tea now and come back to hopefully starting to look towards our solutions. Okay, so we've covered this morning what the problem is and how it's caused, and it's predominantly by these rich non-structural carbohydrates, and they all have a similar function. And we're now going to move on, I guess, after morning tea to start talking about how do we find this balance between allowing that natural grazing ability and allowing that buffering action, and also minimising this problem of overnutrition. Okay, so I spent the first part of my talk, I guess, digging the hole and showing the problem. Most of us know we have that problem, but sometimes a little bit more information about the problem is also helpful as to why the path we're looking at trying to encourage you to explore is so relevant. So our biggest issue is the continuous grazing versus our nutritional value, and this is the problem. They need to graze fairly continuously and ideally move many kilometres throughout the day. And not just graze and move, but horses have social requirements, like Julie alluded to earlier. They need to graze, they need to move, they need to be social. And horses that have this, they show much lower incidences of stereotypies like wind sucking and weaving, because we need to go back every time and remember what they were built to do. It's really nice that they are quite domestic and quite obedient most of the time and do what we like them to do, but they are an amazing athlete, evolved to move, run really fast, and continually graze. So again, we're stuck in that thing of let's let them out to all the paddocks to graze, but by doing that we're mimicking feeding them a lot of grain. And again, so the next option is to lock them up. So the fact is it all comes down to management. And the idea of getting a horse and letting it wander around doesn't work as soon as we have too many horses. I don't want to hear it either, but if we do, I guess it's time to start accepting the fact that we don't need to get rid of any, but we do need to manage them slightly differently if you're getting this kind of issue. Because if this kind of issue is your kind of issue, it's either only a management or a management and an oversupply issue. So we need to consider some different management routines. And our ideal, or our horse euphoria really, has to be constant grazing on grasses that meet a horse's nutritional requirements without causing any metabolic issues. And is it achievable? Maybe. I'm not sure of the answer of that, but maybe it is. But certainly not without planning and management. So I'm assuming that people here today are open to the idea of changing the way that they manage their horses and the way we manage our land. At the moment, I find myself a lot of effort, we were talking about this in the break, so much effort into either locking them up or letting them out, and you lock them up and then they need to be fed more and more frequently because we can't have that gut empty. We let them out and then we panic, so we've got to lock them up again. And there's a lot of effort in all of that, and the feeding and the supplements and all of the rest of it. So we're already putting effort in, but we're putting effort in chasing our tails. So maybe it's time to actually either extend the effort or I guess, you know, use the same amount of effort but divide it off into actually management of our horses in a better and more efficient way. Again, one of the first things that we need to do is avoid the overgrazing. Now, I'm going to touch a little bit on this, but no grass questions, please, because I'll be referring to the grass experts and not discussing them. So from the horse's health perspective, overgrazed land causes lots of issues. The stressed grass is higher in non-structural carbohydrates. And by stress, that's heat stress, frost stress, drought stress, salinity. All of these things are causing the sugars in the grass to be a lot higher than you imagine. Short grass is not necessarily low in non-structural carbohydrates or sugars, definitely. Worms. This is a really important thing. You've probably noticed a whole different shift in the mindset of how to worm your horses. We're trying not to rotate wormers as much now. We would like people to engage the idea of doing fecal egg count tests and then worming appropriately. The idea of worming is about a holistic approach, because once we've wormed them, they need to get more larvae in their body, okay? We're not eliminating parasites, but we're trying to reduce the burden. And we're also trying really hard to reduce the possibility that we have a couple of actives that we have resistant populations for. The larva from the manure piles travels about 50 centimetres away from the manure. So left to their own devices on a great area of land, that's why horses don't necessarily graze too much around their own manure. The larvae only travel 1 to 2 centimetres up the bottom of the grass chute when there's moisture. So if we're not overgrazing and we're not letting the horse eat really close to the ground, they're going to minimise the amount of worm larvae that they're reinfecting themselves with, and colic. We've got not only the issue of the high sugars, but we have the issue of the dirt they're going to take in by grazing too close to the ground, or the fact that there is no feed, so we're throwing hay on the ground and they're picking up all the dirt with the hay, etc. And it doesn't matter how you try to do it, they will drop it on the ground and they will pick it up and they will ingest the dirt. Now, I think a lot of you people have been to the Jane Myers workshop as well, that is also talking about different ways to manage the grazing and things of the horses. Is there people here that have been? I haven't. I missed it, unfortunately. Anyone else? Yeah. So feel free to jump in with any great ideas on management, okay? So let's forgetting about the nutrition at the moment, but how can we manage these slightly differently? So obviously rotation. If we can rotate our paddocks and minimise the effects so that we can not graze the grass to below 5 centimetres, then we're managing the ground cover. We're not talking about the content of what's in the ground cover now, we're just talking about managing the ground cover so that we don't have these big bare patches and erosion patches. We need to entertain. As much as we want our horses to graze freely, constantly, depending on the number of horses we have, we may need to entertain periods of grazing and periods of stabling or yarding, like Megan has started doing on her property. The use of grazing muzzles, and Sylvia was just talking about that in the break with a friend who had a horse that lived for about 5 years with a grazing muzzle. But the alternative to that and getting painful laminitis and major issues is also, I'd pick the grazing muzzle. And only grazing during low sugar conditions. So finding out when the sugars are lowest in the grasses, depending on environmental conditions, is actually really important. As horse owners, and me as a horse owner, I don't really care about the grass, other than it feeding my horses. But it's really important that we know more about it, because unless you know when those low sugar times are, you don't know when it's safe to graze your horses, especially the laminitic prone horses. Well, I'm hoping that we get a little bit more of that from these grass guys, but yes, evening. So the idea of locking your horses up for half the day and letting them out, I would always let them out at night and lock them up in the morning. If you were really brave enough and you wanted to graze them at the best time, it's probably about 2 a.m. to about 6 a.m. in the morning, because that's, unless there's a frost, or unless there's some heat stress, and at any times of stress. So it is really picky. There's not a hard and fast rule, and that is one of the tricks. And so one of the problems is we do need to learn what is going to cause it. As soon as your grass is grazed low, and the poor grass is frantically trying to grow, it's high in sugar. But nighttime definitely as a preference over certainly towards the end of the day. And some of the myth busters. So lush grass. Lush means it's growing in abundance, okay? It's not necessarily higher in sugar. Dry, brown and stressed grass can have dangerously high sugar concentration. So the fact that it looks big and green doesn't mean that's the issue. Colour has nothing to do with the sugar content. Green is from the chlorophyll in the plants, not the sugar. So just because it's green, it doesn't mean that we've got high sugar. Aged hay. I've just stored my hay for 2 years and no mould, we hope. The sugar content hasn't dropped enough to be significant. So just storing it does not drop the sugar enough. And the stem tissue is higher than in non-structural carbohydrates than the leaf tissue. So it's the concentrated stem. So this overgrazing at the top and them getting to the short, and remember right back to the first slide about how efficient they are at grazing really short grass, that's where a lot of the sugar is. And fast-growing grass is not necessarily higher in sugars either. So how do we manage not just the grazing but the nutrition of the horse? Supplementary feeding. We also have to be open to supplementary feeding, because if we're locking them up for periods of time, and we don't necessarily, depending on what you're using your horse for, you don't necessarily get all of your nutritional requirements from just a pasture. Unless we're talking about a pleasure horse or a light riding horse, then it's quite likely. We need to add more fibre to our diet rather than more nutrition, and work how to feed a lot of hay if we're locking and stabling these horses up. Okay, so we need to learn in these management ways, we need to actually think about what they were evolved to do. So we're imagining them wandering around on, thousands of kilometres and grazing, and then we're putting them into a yard. Sometimes you need to do it. So there are ways to do that reasonably effectively. And what I normally advise people to do is use some slow feeders, as slow as you can, small holes in those hay nets, and move them. Don't just chuck the hay over in a big pile, in a big bucket, but use 4, 5 different hay nets and put them in different locations in the yards or in the stables, so the horse will, and you'll notice them just naturally take a little bit from one and then walk to the next one and take a little bit, and they'll just walk themselves around. Soaking hay. Soaking hay will get rid of a lot of the water-soluble carbohydrates. So putting your hay in a hay net and then putting it in a huge thing of water, and actually it's amazing what colour that water and what it smells like comes out after you've done some soaking. So these are ways, I guess, that we can work around that. About an hour. And they will turn their nose up, yep. But normally, like, you're locking up the greedy ones, right? They can't help themselves. Okay, I'll have the celery. I wanted a chocolate biscuit, but I'll eat the celery if that's all there is, because I have to have something. Okay? There is no way to tell the sugar content of the hay you are purchasing without testing it. There is no way. You know, you can get bits of ideas depending on if you know the source of your hay, how pure your hay is, etc. But without testing, it's really hard. And it's really easy for people to say, well, you have to test your hay. What, every 10 bales I buy? They could be different. I'm trusting that the fodder store, do the fodder store care about testing it? No. Do the growers even really care about testing it? No. We should be demanding it, and we need to. Even if all it is asking your fodder store when you get the hay, oh, do you have any of the hay that's tested? Have you got any information on the sugar that's available in this hay? And just by the fact that lots of people are starting to ask it, we may be able to put some pressure on at least the growers to do that testing. I had a little bit of a look at where that testing is available, and we can do it here. Like, it can be done. I know Wagga University will test for certainly water-soluble carbohydrates and some of the sugars. I'm not sure on the cost comparison to doing to the US. I think that that's more of an issue than our ability to do it. Why? I cannot see why we cannot test that hay in Australia. It was really interesting because that came up in a discussion the other day that we don't do it in Australia, it has to be sent. And I think there's a lot of discussion, and I think it's almost become a bit of an urban myth that we can't test for that in Australia, and my brain just went, surely we can. It's the same sort of thing, we're all testing the same sort of thing. So, you know, maybe even by networking here we can try and work out and at least find out the costs and work out how to do it. But certainly by putting a little bit of pressure back on the hay growers so that they understand that horse owners have requirements as well in that area. So you're preferring good quality with no mould and no weeds, etc., but low nutritional quality. And that's where we differ from a lot of the other people that need the hay. Ideally, unimproved pasture cut after the seed heads have been produced, because that's when we've got the lowest sugar content. Now, if you're not grazing, so if you are yarding a horse, then they should be fed at approximately 2% of their body weight. So that's about 10 kilograms of hay a day for a 500 kilo horse. That's a rule of thumb, because some people have horses that would put weight on with that amount, you know, and some will drop. But that's a rule of thumb for the amount of fibre they need to go through their system. And of course, what we need to do is make that last as long as possible. And do we supplement? Due to the limited species and areas of grasses that our horses are grazing on. So when they evolved to graze, they had, you know, 30 species of grasses to eat that were palatable, which gave them nutritional requirements. We're limiting the amount of species of grasses that the horses eat. And so, honestly, many of them can benefit from, I guess, a multivitamin, depending on what they're eating. Horses in medium to heavy work, even if they're grazing, often need supplementary grains, lupins, pellets, etc. But we want to minimise that. We want to minimise the amount of concentrated energy that we're giving them. Magnesium. Magnesium's always interested me. Magnesium's been thrown around as well as adding to help stop the horses put on weight, to manage the insulin issue. It calms your horse down. It's amazing what it does, magnesium. However, in most of the diets that I've looked at, magnesium without the supplement has already been in there at least a 200% of their natural requirement. So is it magnesium? So now let's look at the native grass. So they are lower in non-structural carbohydrates than the introduced grasses, and even when they're grown under the same environmental conditions. So those conditions about the frost and the heat and drought, the native grasses are still lower than our exotic introduced species. So now we're starting to get a pattern for this euphoria of our horses with a property completely covered in low non-structural carbohydrate native grasses with perfect paddock rotation. So the grasses are grazed to the perfect height at the perfect time of the year with a perfect management regime. And does this solve all our problems? And in many ways the answer is yes. Okay, so the low NSC content really does help us on our way to solving these health and metabolic issues. The constant grazing allows the horses to behave in the way they're designed to, wandering, being social and eating every 16 hours out of 24. But again, there's no way we can achieve this without a lot of time, effort and management. So how does the native grass compare with grazing our current pastures? Now this was an interesting thing because I had a bit of a look at it, and there is really no way for me to do a proper comparison, okay, because the grasses are grown differently on different soils. What species of exotic grasses you have in your paddock is different to mine, and the sugars are different, taken at different time of the year, etc., etc. So I thought, like, just roughly, let's throw in, actually I might look at the next one first. Let's throw in, now this is an excellent exotic C3 legume pasture. And I just threw this into Feed Excel, okay? And what this tells you is the levels of some of these nutrients and where they're slightly lacking. And I guess, so here's where I say, you know, a little bit of a multivitamin isn't going to go astray. However, there's some really important, better look at the right one. There's some really important things on this. So this is just Feed Excel, 24/7 access to the hay, nothing added. We got 99% of our digestible energy, so that's good. However, that's often too much. I don't know, you know, that the 100% of daily requirements, the Feed Excel daily requirements can vary from the nutrient, the National Research Council, etc. And I know my horses, if I did them at 100%, they would be enormous. The protein, 247% of their daily requirement of protein in that grass. So that's starting to cause me a bit of a problem in my head. 245% calcium and 120% phosphorus. So we've now gone from a calcium-phosphorus ratio, which is quite important, certainly for our growing horses. I'd be really concerned about our growing horses now, to 2-to-1. And we want about 1-to-1. 335% of daily requirements of magnesium. And they're still telling us we need to add magnesium supplements? That's a whole nother issue. Funnily enough, they've found that excess magnesium can cause some of the behavioural problems that we had magnesium to try and solve. 521% of daily requirements of potassium. I think potassium is one of the next things that's going to be looked at in equine nutrition, because I think it causes a lot of imbalances that are unspoken about at the moment as well. So 521% of potassium, that causes me a little bit of concern as well. Now, a lot of, if you guys have used Feed Excel and put a lot of information in and gotten your own diets out, it's a great program for that. But a lot of these nutrients will say this is in excess of your daily requirements and therefore it will be excreted. Now, I'm pretty sure that's not the case, because if that was the case, we wouldn't all need to be on low sodium diets.
Does that take into account
That is that is part of the problem. And when I started looking at, and I said to Kim, I can have a quick look at that, and to actually look at that properly would take weeks. So that's why this is, like I said, I just chucked this in. All I did was select excellent pasture. So it would be in its prime. You know how at Feed Excel you choose what condition the pasture's in. So here we've got the native grass pasture that I put in. So now we're gone down to 85% digestible energy. I don't know, maybe that's a bit of an issue. 163% of the daily requirement for protein, so it's still quite high, but nowhere near. And especially if we're talking about those at-risk horses. And now we've got calcium and phosphorus, although they're a bit low, they're at least at a nice ratio. And that's fairly important. We go down to magnesium, we're still at 161% of our daily requirements, but it's a lot less when it comes to sort of complete oversupply. And 300% of potassium. So that was just interesting. Factual? No. Bit of a throw in the air, and it's something that we need to research. But like was said earlier, we don't have a magic bullet here. We don't have all the answers. We don't know how it's all going to work yet. And this is not a one-size-fits-all and it's going to solve all your problems kind of solution. So, is there a downside to the native pasture? Probably, yeah. And again, we're investigating this, so there are things that we're all going to be learning here together. And revisiting from earlier, that a horse will eat, trample or damage 3% of its body weight per day, exotic grasses do cope a bit better with the traffic and damage. So that's something to consider. Again, too many horses is going to be an issue on this pasture. So we need to counteract that. We need to reduce the traffic on the grasses. We need to maybe then coordinate the yarding and the stabling with that. We need to be able to rotate horses grazing on there. And for adequate rotation, we do need to look at how many horses have we got grazing and how many paddocks we have to rotate with. And God forbid, we may need to see if we need to reduce our stock level. They do produce less dry matter per area than exotics. And palatability testing is being done on that, but we really are not sure. We haven't thoroughly tested, and the selective grazing nature makes me concerned that we put in a whole lot of native grasses and they decide they like one of them and then stand there in the middle of the rest of them up to here and don't eat it. And because us as horse owners, our first response to that is like, oh my God, they're dropping weight, we better give them hay. I don't know the answer to that. They're just questions that have come up in my head. They're not a magic bullet, and if you're not managing what you've currently got well, then manage that well first as well, okay? So a first step is just managing what you've got, or at least starting the thought process of how do I manage it to get this balance correctly. Native grasses is not going to solve a management issue. So if you're already managing badly, putting the native grass in there isn't going to solve that issue. So, but I think taking this avenue of investigation is worth our effort, because if we can get there and we can find that place where we can allow our horses to graze and move and be social and not suffer any of these metabolic issues that we've been imposing on them, then it's got to be worth our effort to try. And it's got to be worth the effort of at least some of us who, and obviously the people in this room are open to the option of trying and are looking for that. It has to be us, those of us who know there's a problem, that actually take the lead and start investigating this. We might go down some avenue and some of it might be wrong, but I think we're on the right track. It may take 5 to 10 years to establish on your property, but what's your property going to look like in 5 to 10 years if we don't start it now? So thank you. That's where I'd like to hand over.